For almost 100 years, scientists believed the Apurimac River was the most distant source of the Amazon. It starts high in the Nevadomysmi Mountains of southern Peru. A small stream trickles down the snowy slopes, slowly gathering strength until it becomes the Apurimac. It was the official story for decades. In fact, if you go up there, you'll see a wooden cross marking the source of the Amazon. Tour guides still take people to see it. But in 2014, new research changed everything. Two scientists, James Kontos and Nicholas Tripsevich, used GPS data, satellite maps, and actual kayaking expeditions to track every twist of the upper rivers. What they found surprised everyone. The Mantaro River, not the Apurimac, is the longest starting point. The Mantaro begins even farther away, in the Cordillera Rumicruz, northeast of Lima. From its source, it flows north, joins the Apurimac, and only then becomes part of the Amazon's mighty system. So, which is the real start? That depends on how you define beginning. The Mantaro River is longer, so if you're measuring by maximum length, it wins. But the Apurimac has more consistent flow year-round, so others still argue for it. It's a scientific debate that still isn't fully settled. Either way, both rivers are born in the Andes Mountains, and that's where the Amazon story truly begins. What's amazing is how this massive river, which eventually pushes 20% of the world's fresh water into the ocean, starts out so small. Picture a high-altitude stream trickling through rock and ice, barely wide enough to step across. That's the beginning. The Andes Mountains act like a giant water tower for the Amazon. Rain and melted snow from the peaks feed countless small rivers: Mantaro, Apurimac, Ene, Tambo, Urubamba, each one merging into the next like veins feeding a growing heart. Eventually, these rivers form the Ucayali River, one of the major arteries of the upper Amazon basin. It flows north, winding through forests, valleys, and deep green canyons. Then something important happens. The Ucayali meets another river, the Marañón. This confluence is a big deal. Most countries, scientists, and maps consider this meeting point where the Ucayali and Marañón unite as the official start of the Amazon River. We're still in Peru at this point. The two rivers merge not far from the jungle city of Iquitos, one of the largest cities in the world that can't be reached by road. From this spot, the Amazon River is born. Once the Ucayali and Marañón come together, the river gets bigger fast, and so does its influence. The waterway becomes the life source of the rainforest. Villages spring up along its edges. Cargo boats, dugout canoes, and river dolphins begin to appear. The forest around it is alive in every sense. Giant trees lean over the water. Bright blue butterflies dance above the surface. Monkeys swing from branch to branch. The river becomes a highway, but also a barrier. It's both connection and isolation, depending on who you are and where you're going. The river keeps growing. As it flows through Peru, it absorbs water from dozens of tributaries: Napo, Huallaga, Pastaza, and more. Some are crystal clear. Others are muddy or black with tannins. But they all feed the same giant body of water. Then the river crosses a border and becomes something else entirely. Once the Amazon enters Brazil, it goes through a name change. From the border until it reaches the city of Manaus, Brazilians don't call it the Amazon at all. They call it the Solimões River. Why the name change? It's just a regional tradition. In Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, people refer to the river as the Amazon, right after the Ucayali and Marañón merge. But in Brazil, that name only kicks in later, after the Solimões meets the Rio Negro. This naming detail might sound small, but it highlights how massive the river system is. It's so big, different cultures along its path treat it like different rivers. As the Solimões flows through the Brazilian rainforest, it becomes wide, winding, and incredibly powerful. The river carves through dense jungle, often flooding the land for months during the rainy season. Giant trees adapt by growing in standing water. Fish spawn in the flooded forest, and people move with the rhythm of the river, building their homes on stilts. The river is now carrying millions of liters of water every second, and it still hasn't reached full strength. That moment comes at a legendary place in the heart of the Amazon. Just outside Manaus, the largest city in the Amazon, The Solimões River meets the Rio Negro, and something amazing happens. The two rivers do not mix immediately. For more than 6 kilometers, almost 4 miles, they flow side by side, clearly divided. One river is muddy and tan, the Solimões. The other is dark and almost black, the Rio Negro. The line between them is sharp, like two ribbons of paint flowing in parallel. Why don't they mix? It comes down to physics. The Solimões is cooler, denser, and flows faster. The Rio Negro is warmer, lighter, and flows slower. It takes time and distance for them to finally blend into one. This moment is known as the meeting of waters, in Portuguese, Encontro das Águas, and it marks the start of what Brazilians and most of the world officially call the Amazon River. From this point forward, the river is unstoppable. The Amazon, the biggest river on Earth by volume, wasn't always called the Amazon. In fact, the name it carries today has an unexpected backstory. It involves a Spanish expedition, a violent encounter in the jungle, and a group of legendary warrior women. The year was 1541. A Spanish explorer named Francisco de Orellana was part of a mission to find riches, spices, gold, and possibly the legendary city of El Dorado, somewhere in the uncharted forests east of the Andes. He started out with another conquistador, Gonzalo Pizarro, heading into the rainforest from what is now Ecuador. Things went downhill fast, supplies ran low, food was almost non-existent, so they made a desperate decision: split up. Orellana would take a small group of men and a boat and follow the river east in search of help, food, or something, anything. But instead of circling back, Orellana just kept going. He and his men floated downriver for months, traveling through parts of the Amazon rainforest no European had ever seen before. Along the way, they encountered dozens of indigenous tribes, dense jungle, and overwhelming heat. The river carried them farther east, deeper into what felt like another world. And then, they saw something they didn't expect. At some point along the river, Orellana's expedition was attacked by indigenous warriors. Nothing unusual there, but what stood out this time, according to Orellana's written account, was that many of the warriors were women, armed, skilled, and aggressive. Orellana and his men were shocked. These weren't just women defending their homes, these were fighters leading the attack. This was completely unfamiliar to European eyes. Back in Spain, women weren't part of armies. They weren't warriors, and yet here they were, fighting with skill and ferocity. So Orellana made a mental connection. These women reminded him of something he'd read in stories, a group of fierce female warriors from Greek mythology known as the Amazons. And just like that, the river got its name, Amazonas. In ancient Greek stories, the Amazons were a tribe of warrior women who lived far from Greece, possibly near the Black Sea or in Scythia, modern-day Iran and Central Asia. They were said to be tall, strong, and skilled in archery, horseback riding, and combat. The myths claimed they lived without men, or only used them for reproduction, raising only female children. They were fierce, independent, and lived by their own rules. The Amazon women appear in stories involving heroes like Hercules, Achilles, and Theseus. The Greeks were fascinated and a little afraid of the idea. A society run by warrior women? That was radical. So when Orellana came face to face with women fighting in the jungle of South America, his brain reached for the only reference point he had: Greek legend. He called them Amazons, and he named the river after them. That's where things get blurry. Some historians say Orellana exaggerated the story. Maybe he saw a few women among a larger group of male warriors. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, or maybe he invented the whole thing to make his story more exciting when he returned to Spain. Others suggest that indigenous tribes with female warriors did exist. After all, South America had hundreds of distinct cultures, some matriarchal, some with unique gender roles, and some with very different ideas of warfare and society. There are records of tribes like the Icamiabas, a group mentioned in oral traditions who lived near the Namunda River and were said to be female warriors. It's possible Orellana's account was based in reality, at least in part. Still, we don't know for sure. What we do know is this: the idea of warrior women made such an impact on Orellana and the European world that the name stuck. The name Amazon might not actually come from Greek mythology at all, or at least, not entirely. Some scholars suggest that the name might have indigenous roots, specifically from the Tupi language spoken by native peoples in parts of Brazil. One theory says that the word comes from Amazona, which roughly translates to boat destroyer. In Tupi, Ama refers to something related to water, and Asona might relate to destruction or breaking. Put it together, and Amazona could describe the violent waters or dangerous obstacles that destroyed canoes and boats, something the Amazon River is definitely known for. Think about it: massive floating logs, whirlpools, sudden rapids, and flooding forests. The river is a beast, especially during the rainy season. If you're trying to navigate it with a fragile wooden canoe, it could easily be a boat destroyer. Over time, Amazona may have been misheard, reshaped, or translated into Amazons by Portuguese or Spanish speakers, especially when combined with the myth of the Greek Amazons. It's possible both stories merged into one. In that case, the name Amazon might be a mix of local language and European imagination. However it happened, the name caught on fast. By the late 1500s, maps were already labeling the giant river as Rio Amazonas. The Portuguese and Spanish began using the name in official documents. As European explorers continued to chart the interior of South America, the word Amazon became standard. The name spread to even towns and rivers named Amazonas in Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. Today, when you hear Amazon, you probably think of the rainforest, the river, and maybe even the company. But it all started with a strange encounter on a boat, deep in the jungle, nearly 500 years ago. When you look at the Amazon River today, it's easy to assume it's always been like this, flowing east from the Andes to the Atlantic, carving through the jungle like a slow-moving beast. But the truth is, the Amazon once flowed in the opposite direction. Around 100 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous period, South America was a completely different place. There were no Andes Mountains. The continent was mostly flat, covered in vast wetlands, rivers, and inland seas. The Atlantic Ocean was just starting to open up, slowly pushing South America away from Africa. Back then, dinosaurs still roamed the earth, and the Amazon basin was part of a low-lying tropical landscape. The rivers of that time flowed west, draining into a shallow sea where the Pacific coast is today. There was no giant land barrier in the way. Water from the central part of the continent would drift slowly westward, emptying into the Pacific. Fossil evidence and ancient sediments found in the Andes support this idea. They show signs of east-to-west river flow long before the modern Amazon took shape. But then, something massive happened. The Andes began to rise. About 65 to 45 million years ago, the Earth's tectonic plates got busy. The Nazca Plate, sitting in the Pacific Ocean, began to collide with the South American plate. And as the two plates pushed against each other, the land crumpled. Mountains started forming. And over millions of years, those mountains grew into what we now call the Andes, the longest continental mountain range on Earth. This process didn't happen overnight. It was slow, violent, and relentless. With every inch the mountains grew, they acted like a giant wall, cutting off the westward flow of rivers. Water that had once flowed freely toward the Pacific suddenly hit a rising wall of rock. And when that happened, it had nowhere to go. So it stopped. And over time, it started going the other way. This is one of the rarest things that can happen in the history of rivers, a full reversal of direction. As the Andes continued to rise, rainfall and runoff from the eastern slopes began forming new rivers. These young rivers flowed east away from the mountains, not toward them. At the same time, sediment from the rising Andes began piling up on the western side of the continent, forming a slight slope downward to the east. Eventually, the balance tipped. The rivers that had once flowed west into the Pacific were now being pushed back, forced to flow east instead. This transition didn't happen in a year or even 1,000 years. It likely took millions of years to fully reverse the system. But once it did, the Amazon began carving a new path, a new drainage system, flowing from the Andes all the way to the Atlantic. And that's how the Amazon River, as we know it today, began to take shape. When the Andes rose and blocked the westward flow of water, something strange formed in the middle of South America, a giant inland sea. Geologists call this the Piba system. It was a vast wetland, not quite a lake, not quite a swamp, that stretched across what is now western Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. This huge body of water existed for millions of years. It was filled with crocodile-like reptiles, massive turtles, and ancient fish. Some scientists believe the Piba system was home to more freshwater species than any other wetland in the world at that time. But it wasn't a stable system. Sediment from the Andes kept pouring in, slowly filling the basin, and new rivers coming down from the mountains continued to dig deeper and longer paths eastward. Eventually, this inland sea drained. The Amazon River took over, capturing the Pibas Basin and transforming it from a shallow swamp into part of the Amazon's river network. You might be wondering, how do scientists know any of this? The answer is buried in the sediment layers and fossils found deep beneath the rainforest floor. Core samples taken from parts of the Amazon basin show ancient marine sediments, meaning these areas were once under seawater. In other places, scientists have found freshwater mollusk fossils indicating the existence of massive lakes and swamps. But here's the biggest clue. The sediment in the Amazon River today mostly comes from the Andes. Over 90% of the sediment carried by the river, all that mud, silt, and sand, is traced back to the Andes Mountains. That tells us something critical. The modern Amazon River is shaped and fed by the Andes, and that wouldn't be possible if the river still flowed west. The reversal of the Amazon River wasn't just a local event. It reshaped the entire continent. It created the modern Amazon Basin, a drainage system covering more than 7 million square kilometers, a climate engine that helps drive global weather patterns, habitats for millions of species, from river dolphins to sloths to orchids, a source of fresh water that still influences ocean currents and carbon cycles today. This reversal turned the Amazon from just another tropical river into a planetary force. It allowed the rainforest to expand eastward. It helped create some of the richest biodiversity on Earth, and it changed the direction, literally, of South America's natural history. Even today, the Amazon is not done evolving. The river still shifts its course. It still carves new channels, floods forests, and changes direction. Not on a continental scale like before, but on a local level year after year. In the rainy season, it spills out over 10 kilometers wide in some places, creating flooded forests where fish swim between trees, and the land beneath it still feels the pressure of tectonic forces. The Andes are still rising slowly but surely. Erosion continues. The balance of water and sediment is still in motion. The Amazon may seem timeless, but it's not. It's the result of ancient forces, and it's still part of the living, changing Earth. Long before any European ever laid eyes on the Amazon, the rainforest was already a human world. Not untouched, not empty, but alive with people, ideas, trade, farms, and innovation. For thousands of years, millions of indigenous people had shaped the jungle, and what they created wasn't a civilization of stone and concrete, but something far more adapted to its environment, a civilization of forest and earth. For centuries, scientists and historians believed the Amazon was too harsh for complex societies. The soil was too poor, the jungle too thick, the environment too unstable. At best, it was thought to support small, scattered communities of hunter-gatherers. But that image, the untouched jungle myth, is now crumbling. Archaeologists are uncovering clear evidence that before European contact, the Amazon was home to advanced, organized societies that lived in sustainable harmony with the rainforest. One of the first clues came from the dirt itself. The soil in the Amazon is notoriously poor. Tropical rains wash nutrients away quickly. That's why modern agriculture in the region often requires fertilizers and massive deforestation just to work. But scattered across the basin, researchers began finding something strange. Patches of dark, fertile soil, much darker than the surrounding dirt, and much more productive. Locals call it terra preta, or black earth. Scientists eventually realized that it was not natural, it was engineered. Ancient Amazonians had created it by mixing charcoal, burned plant matter, animal bones, food waste, broken pottery, and human feces into the soil. This turned weak, acidic earth into a nutrient-rich, self-regenerating ecosystem. Terra preta doesn't just grow crops, It keeps getting better over time, and it can still be found today, hundreds, in some places thousands of years after it was made. This wasn't a random discovery, it was technology, and it allowed people to build sustainable farms right in the heart of the jungle. But these weren't farms the way we think of them today. Ancient Amazonians didn't bulldoze the land and plant giant monocultures. They didn't rip out every tree to grow rows of corn. Instead, they practiced agroforestry, blending agriculture into the forest itself. They cultivated manioc, cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, fruits like papaya and guava, and nuts like Brazil nut and peach palm. They encouraged the growth of trees that fed them, healed them, or gave them tools and fiber. Some parts of the Amazon that appear wild today are actually old, human-planted forests still full of domesticated tree species that were intentionally placed and protected generations ago. This approach allowed them to produce food without breaking the ecosystem. No need to clear the forest, no need to fight it, just grow with it. They created abundance while leaving the canopy mostly intact. From a distance it looked like jungle. Up close it was homegrown design. For a long time, the jungle itself hid what came next. You could walk for days in the Amazon and never see anything man-made, but in the 21st century, that changed. Archaeologists started using LiDAR, a laser mapping tool mounted on planes that can scan the ground through the trees, and what they found was astonishing. Beneath the forest, massive geometric shapes started to appear: squares, circles, long straight roads, and even moats and causeways. These weren't isolated huts. They were planned settlements, some of them as large as small cities, linked together by paths and waterways. In Bolivia and western Brazil, entire networks of towns, villages, and ceremonial structures began to emerge. Some researchers describe them as garden cities, designed not around destruction but around coexistence. There were roads raised above seasonal floods, fish ponds to raise aquatic food, canals for transport and irrigation, terraces for crops, even ditches and berms that may have served both defensive and symbolic functions. And the most important thing, these societies lasted for centuries. This wasn't a one-off culture. It was a system, a way of life that scaled across the rainforest. These weren't isolated pockets of people. Ancient Amazonian cultures were connected to larger civilizations across South America. They traded with the highland empires of the Andes, first with cultures like the Wari and Tiwanaku, and later with the Inca. Artifacts found deep in the Amazon basin include highland ceramics, gold and copper ornaments, and coca leaves grown in mountain climates. This means people were moving, ideas were spreading, and goods were flowing along long trade routes, through rivers, footpaths, and portage trails that crisscrossed the continent. Some of these routes likely followed the same rivers we know today: the Madeira, the Tapajos, the Ucayali. Others may be lost, overgrown, waiting to be found again. The Amazon wasn't a dead end, it was part of a living web of cultures. Because these societies didn't build giant stone temples or leave behind written records, many assumed they were simple, but that's a failure of imagination, not evidence. These people engineered soil. They created managed forests. They built villages with planned layouts, linked by roads and canals. They knew how to cultivate the land without draining its life. They navigated thousands of kilometers of waterways and had knowledge of the stars, the seasons, and the cycles of nature. And when the Spanish and Portuguese finally arrived in the 1500s, they met these cultures firsthand. Explorers like Orellana described large, prosperous settlements along the riverbanks. They saw people wearing feathered robes, using gold ornaments, building multi-story homes of wood and clay. Then the diseases came, and within a few generations, almost everything vanished. When you lose 90% of a population in less than a century, you don't just lose people, you lose memory, language, tools, tradition, and infrastructure. The roads go unused, the farms collapse, the canals clog with silt, forest vines wrap around buildings, termites eat the beams, and after a while, what was once a village becomes a clearing, then a grove, then just part of the forest again. That's what happened all across the Amazon, and it's why, for so long, nobody believed the jungle had ever been full of people. But now we know better. Today, modern indigenous communities still carry pieces of this ancient knowledge. Many still farm terra preta, Others practice forms of agroforestry passed down over generations. They know the plants, the rhythms of the river, the animals that come and go with the flood, and scientists are paying attention. Because as we face a future of climate instability, deforestation, and soil collapse, the people who lived sustainably in the rainforest for thousands of years may have already found the answers we're desperately searching for. They didn't build skyscrapers, they didn't invent engines or digital networks, but they created systems that lasted without poisoning the world around them. That's civilization, and it happened in the Amazon long before Columbus. The first time a European ship entered the mouth of the Amazon River, it wasn't greeted by jungle silence, it was met by a deafening roar. The Atlantic Ocean surges into the river's mouth with such force that it creates a tidal wave called the pororoca, a thunderous wall of water that can reach over 4 meters high and travel miles upstream. It's not a place you stumble into by accident, but in 1500, a Spanish navigator named Vicente Yáñez Pinzón did just that. Pinzón wasn't just anyone. He had captained the Niña on Columbus's first voyage, but this time he was leading his own expedition, sailing down the coast of South America, trying to find riches and new lands for Spain. As his ship approached what we now call Brazil, he stumbled upon something enormous, a wide, muddy river so powerful that its fresh water colored the ocean for over 100 kilometers out to sea. He had no idea what it was, but he knew it wasn't ordinary. He sailed into the mouth and became the first European to lay eyes on the Amazon River. He didn't stay long. The pororoca and the river's powerful current almost capsized his ships. He collected some local wood, noted the size of the river, and turned back. He didn't explore deep inland, and his reports were brief, but that moment in 1500 marked the first known European contact with the Amazon. Still, Pinzón barely scratched the surface. The real wild expedition was yet to come. If Pinzón was the first to see the Amazon's mouth, Francisco de Orellana was the first European to travel its entire length from the Andes to the Atlantic, and survive to tell the tale. In 1541, Orellana set out as part of a larger expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro, half-brother of the infamous conquistador Francisco Pizarro. Their mission was simple: find El Dorado, the mythical city of gold, and a land they called La Canela, a supposed cinnamon-rich region that would rival the spice markets of Asia. They started high in the Ecuadorian Andes, with over 4,000 men and pack animals pushing eastward into the rainforest, but they had no idea what they were walking into. Within months, the expedition was in chaos. The jungle was brutal. Men dropped from heat, disease, starvation, and insects. Food ran out, their clothes rotted, the horses died, rivers became obstacles, not highways. Rain turned paths into mud. The group splintered, morale collapsed, and Pizarro gave Orellana permission to take a small detachment downriver to find food and return. Orellana never came back. What happened next is one of the most legendary journeys in exploration history. With a crew of around 50 men, Orellana's raft floated deeper and deeper into a world no European had ever seen. They thought they'd be gone for a few days. They ended up sailing the entire Amazon River, over 6,000 kilometers, and surviving what no one else ever had. The journey was anything but smooth. Rivers can look calm, but the Amazon was full of hidden dangers. Orellana's men faced everything: mosquito swarms that left them swollen and sick, floating debris that shattered rafts, and wildlife that seemed pulled from myth. Giant snakes, howling monkeys, came in sliding into the water under the cover of darkness. But the greatest challenge wasn't nature, it was people. Orellana's crew passed dozens of indigenous communities along the riverbanks. Some were curious, some were hostile, others ignored the invaders altogether. But many were powerful, organized, armed with bows and poisoned arrows, and familiar with the terrain. Orellana's men were always outnumbered. In some cases, they barely escaped with their lives. And here's where myth began to mix with observation. According to Orellana, at one point his expedition was attacked by a fierce group of women warriors. He claimed they fought alongside male warriors with incredible strength and accuracy, living in their own villages, rejecting contact with men except for reproduction. The Spanish soldiers were stunned. Back in Europe, they had grown up with stories of the Amazons, mythical warrior women from Greek legend. And now, here they were, supposedly real, battling them in a jungle thousands of miles from home. Was it true? Hard to say. Modern historians debate it. Some believe Orellana may have encountered matriarchal societies or misunderstood what he saw. Others think the story was exaggerated, a way to impress the Spanish crown, but the name stuck. From that point on, Europeans began calling the river Amazonas. Part of what had pushed Orellana and Pizarro eastward in the first place was the dream of El Dorado, the golden city that appeared on European maps despite no evidence it existed. The other draw was La Canela, a land where cinnamon supposedly grew in abundance. Since cinnamon was worth more than gold at the time, finding a source outside of Asia would have changed the spice trade forever. Spoiler, they found neither. Instead, they wandered into one of the world's most complex ecosystems, suffered incredible losses, and barely escaped with their lives. Orellana finally reached the Atlantic in 1542, with a ragged crew and a story that no one fully believed. Some accused him of desertion. Others thought he had fabricated the journey. But as the years passed and more explorers ventured into the basin, they started to realize he was telling the truth, or at least most of it. Orellana's expedition was more than just a wild survival story. It was the first real European map of the Amazon. He provided names for rivers, descriptions of people, and accounts of terrain that would guide explorers for centuries. But his writings also sparked a centuries-long misunderstanding. He described large populations, multi-story homes, vast farmlands, and powerful tribes. But when later explorers went back, they found nothing. Small villages, sparse settlements, no cities, no Amazons. So they assumed he had lied. What they didn't realize was that the populations he saw had been devastated by disease, likely introduced by Orellana himself, or earlier contact on the coasts. The collapse had already begun by the time the next expeditions arrived. What Orellana had seen may have been the last glimpse of a thriving pre-Columbian Amazonian world, already on the edge of destruction. Pinzon saw the mouth of the river. Orellana rode its veins, and behind them came wave after wave of missionaries, soldiers, settlers, and opportunists. The Amazon had been introduced to the outside world, not gently, but violently. The first Europeans didn't understand what they were looking at. They saw jungle, gold, and spices. They didn't see the complexity, the cultures, or the balance already in place. But that moment from 1500 to 1542 changed everything. The Amazon was no longer an unknown. It had become a target. In the 1600s, the Amazon was still mostly a mystery to Europeans. It stretched for thousands of kilometers across dense jungle, and most of its tributaries were unmapped, unnamed, and unknown. But little by little, that started to change. Not through military conquests or royal decree, but through a quieter force, religion. And the man who drew the first full map of the Amazon River wasn't a soldier or a king. He was a priest. By the late 1600s, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns were competing for influence across South America. Both powers wanted territory, but in the interior, deep in the Amazon, they relied on a different kind of authority to get it. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, were Catholic missionaries known for discipline, education, and their willingness to travel to the edges of the known world. Their job in the Amazon wasn't just to convert souls, it was also to build footholds for European control. They came with crosses, not swords, but their presence would reshape the rainforest for centuries. Jesuit missions were often the first sustained European settlements in the Amazon basin. They built churches, schools, and small towns, trying to gather scattered indigenous communities into centralized locations. From a colonial perspective, this made everything easier. Easier to tax, to track, to govern, and of course to convert. Some missions were relatively peaceful, others were more forceful. Indigenous people were often pressured or coerced into leaving their ancestral lands and adopting European customs, languages, and religion. The Jesuits saw this as salvation, but it also meant the loss of identity, tradition, and independence for the people they tried to civilize. And yet, in the middle of all this, one Jesuit priest decided to do something no one had done before. He tried to map the Amazon. His name was Samuel Fritz, a Czech-born Jesuit missionary who spent more than 40 years in the Amazon. He arrived in the late 1600s and was assigned to work with indigenous communities along the upper Amazon in what is now Peru and Ecuador. But Fritz wasn't content with just preaching. He was a keen observer. He learned local languages, traveled by canoe from village to village, and kept detailed notes on what he saw, not just the people, but the rivers themselves. As he moved through the jungle, he measured distances, noted tributaries, and tried to piece together a larger picture of how all the waterways connected. In 1707, he completed his most ambitious project, a hand-drawn map of the entire Amazon River. It was one of the most detailed and complete maps of the region ever created. And for more than 100 years, it was the best guide anyone had to the Amazon basin. Was it perfect? Not even close. Fritz mistakenly believed the Marañón River was the true source of the Amazon, a view that was debated for centuries and still sparks conversation today. His map exaggerated some regions and downplayed others, but it was a start. It showed something critical. The Amazon was a single system, not a collection of isolated rivers, but one enormous interconnected web stretching from the Andes to the Atlantic. And that changed how Europeans thought about it, as a place that could theoretically be explored, traveled, even colonized. Fritz didn't just map the land. He also helped establish a network of Jesuit missions along the river. These weren't just religious centers. They became early administrative zones, places where European languages, laws, and trade goods entered the Amazon. From the colonial government's perspective, this was perfect. The Jesuits did the hard work of establishing contact with indigenous peoples, organizing them into communities, and teaching them Portuguese or Spanish. Once the groundwork was laid, the state could move in and formalize control. But not everyone was happy with that arrangement. By the mid-1700s, both the Spanish and Portuguese crowns began to see the Jesuits as too powerful. In many places, the missions were wealthier, better organized, and more respected than the colonial governments themselves. Some Jesuit leaders even refused to turn their indigenous converts over for forced labor or taxation, defying royal authority. Eventually, it reached a breaking point. In 1767, the Spanish crown expelled the Jesuits from its colonies. The Portuguese had already done so a few years earlier. Just like that, hundreds of missions were abandoned or handed over to secular priests and government officials. Many indigenous communities that had relied on Jesuit protection were left vulnerable to slavery, disease, and exploitation. Without the Jesuits, the colonial governments were free to tighten their grip. But the legacy of the missions remained. The towns they built often became the seeds of modern Amazonian cities. Their names, many still religious, dot the map: San Ignacio, Santa Rosa, São Gabriel, and dozens more. And the maps, like Fritz's, were copied, translated, and passed along to new generations of explorers, traders, and colonizers. At a glance, a map seems simple: lines, rivers, names. But in the Amazon, maps were political weapons. Who drew the river? Who claimed its tributaries? Who named the towns? Every map that came out of the missions gave Europe more power over the unknown. With each river labeled, with each village marked, the Amazon became less of a mystery and more of a commodity, something that could be claimed, divided, and ruled. But these maps also helped preserve something else: knowledge of a world that was disappearing fast. Many of the places Fritz and others recorded no longer exist. Whole cultures collapsed under disease and displacement. Entire languages vanished. But on those old Jesuit maps, you can still find their names, echoes of a time when the Amazon was filled with dozens of unique nations, each with their own way of life. To be clear, the Jesuits were not neutral. They were missionaries with a mission: convert indigenous people to Christianity and integrate them into European systems. That meant suppressing native religions, rewriting social structures, and reshaping entire belief systems. But compared to what came after, rubber barons, slave traders, and corporate interests, the Jesuit period was almost gentle. They protected some communities from outright enslavement. They created literacy in native languages, and they built settlements that, at least temporarily, slowed the pace of destruction. That's why their legacy is so complicated. They were both builders and erasers, both preservers and intruders, and the maps they left behind still guide us through that contradiction. With the Jesuits gone and the missions weakened, a new chapter of the Amazon story began, one marked not by religion, but by profit. In the early 1800s, the Amazon was still largely seen by outsiders as an inaccessible wilderness, a place of mystery, danger, and impossible distance. The rivers flowed endlessly, but few from the outside world could truly follow their course. Canoes were too slow. Expeditions were costly and deadly. The jungle kept its secrets. And then came steam. With it, everything changed. The first steam-powered boats entered the Amazon basin in the mid-1800s. At first, they were small, experimental, and slow. But even so, they broke a barrier that had held for centuries. For the first time, people could navigate upriver against the current, deep into the rainforest, without relying on wind or manpower. In 1853, Brazil officially opened the Amazon River to international navigation. Countries like Britain and the United States were quick to send in their own boats. The dream was simple: connect the world to the rainforest's vast natural resources. Timber, medicinal plants, exotic fruits, and above all, rubber. The Amazon was no longer a remote frontier, it was now a global highway, and steamships were the new kings of the river. Rubber wasn't new. Indigenous people had used the latex from rubber trees for centuries to waterproof clothes, make shoes, and create balls for games. But in the 19th century, rubber became a global obsession. Why? One word: industry. As machines, bicycles, and eventually automobiles took over the modern world, they all needed rubber tires, belts, and hoses, and nearly all the world's rubber came from one place: Hevea brasiliensis, the wild rubber tree native to the Amazon rainforest. Suddenly, the jungle wasn't just valuable, it was indispensable, and the rush began. Two cities rose fast on the tide of rubber: Manaus in Brazil and Iquitos in Peru. In the late 1800s, Manaus became the wealthiest city in South America. It built electric streetlights, a grand opera house, European-style mansions, and even imported furniture from Paris. Steamships docked daily, bringing traders and goods from across the Atlantic. In the middle of the jungle, a tropical version of Europe sprang to life, fueled entirely by rubber money. Iquitos followed suit. Though landlocked and deep in the Peruvian Amazon, the city exploded in population and wealth, its port teeming with traffic, its streets buzzing with newcomers. Both cities owed everything to the trees and the people who bled them. Rubber didn't come from plantations, not yet. It came from wild trees, spaced irregularly across vast swaths of rainforest. The only way to harvest it was to send people deep into the jungle to tap trees one by one. That job fell to indigenous laborers and enslaved workers. The system was brutal. Men were forced to travel for days or weeks through flooded forest and insect-ridden jungle, collecting latex under harsh quotas. If they didn't meet them, they were beaten, tortured, or killed. In some regions, entire indigenous groups were enslaved. In others, they were simply wiped out to clear land or send a message. The worst abuses occurred in places like the Putumayo region, near the borders of Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, where companies like the Peruvian Amazon Company ran what were essentially slave camps. Workers were chained, starved, mutilated. Some testimonies describe children being burned alive or women forced into sexual slavery, and all of it was funded by rubber. For about 40 years, the Amazon ruled the global rubber market. But with that boom came consequences. European and American traders brought diseases like smallpox, flu, and measles, which devastated indigenous populations already weakened by exploitation. River towns, once thriving with culture, became hubs of death and displacement. The forest too suffered. Though not clear-cut in the way we think of today, entire ecosystems were disrupted, trails and camps expanded, rivers were polluted, and the balance of life in many regions broke under the strain. But the biggest change came not from inside the Amazon, but from far away. In 1876, a British explorer named Henry Wickham smuggled thousands of rubber seeds out of Brazil and shipped them to Kew Gardens in London. From there, the seeds were sent to British colonies in Sri Lanka, India, and Malaysia, where they were cultivated into organized plantations. Unlike the Amazon, these plantations had neat rows of rubber trees. No need to trek through jungle, no irregular spacing, no unpredictable harvests. By the early 1900s, Southeast Asia had taken over the global rubber market. Their production was cheaper, faster, and more reliable. The Amazon couldn't compete. And just like that, the rubber boom collapsed. Manaus and Iquitos fell into decay. The opera houses stood, but the money was gone. The streets emptied. The wealth vanished as fast as it had arrived. But the damage to people, to cultures, to the forest remained. The Amazon River had been a highway for centuries. But during the rubber boom, it became something else, a conveyor belt of exploitation. Rubber barons used the rivers to move their product, to ship out supplies, and to haul in more labor. Mission stations were turned into outposts. Indigenous villages were turned into camps. Steamships carried not just goods, but control. And yet the river also carried resistance. Some indigenous communities fled deeper into the forest. Others sabotaged rubber operations. A few struck fragile alliances with missionaries or rival groups just to survive. Not everyone gave in, but almost everyone was affected. Today, the scars of the rubber boom still shape Amazonian life. You can still visit the Teatro Amazonas in Manaus, a monument to Europe's dream of civilization in the heart of the jungle. You can walk the crumbling streets of Iquitos, where colonial buildings lean with age, and the river still carries oil tankers and fishing boats. But you can also find families who remember what was lost, languages, traditions, names. In some areas, the stories are whispered quietly. In others, they've been written down, reclaimed, and taught to the next generation. Rubber made the Amazon world famous. It also nearly destroyed the people who had lived there for thousands of years. In the next video, we'll move beyond the rubber boom and into the age of science, conservation, and controversy. As outsiders continued to flood in, botanists, oil companies, missionaries, and activists, the Amazon became not just a place of resources but of ideas and conflict.